And we continue now with Africa World Hour, a 2140 feature. And today we talk about this, an important anniversary coming up, particularly in the literary jazz poetry circles. So we talk about an event that is taking place very soon to mark the anniversary, 5 years on since the passing of Myesha Jenkins, a pioneer of spoken word in South Africa and, of course, an icon of feminist creativity and action. She was more than a poet. Myesha Jenkins was a voice, a bridge, a pulse in the rhythm of South Africa's literary heart. Through her words, she carved spaces where stories could breathe, spaces where the page met the stage and the stage met the soul. Today we remember her not only for what she wrote, but what she made possible. Joining us now is her friend, journalist, a feminist writer, human rights activist, and fellow cultural worker Gail Smith, to reflect on the legacy, the lessons, and of course the love that Myesha Jenkins gave to the world. And she received. A very good evening to you, Gail. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Tsepiso. Good evening to your viewers and listeners. And what a beautiful introduction of Myesha. Thank you.
Well, we thought something inspired to really reflect who she is. As I mentioned, the fact that she inspired many across generations, and which is why we have seen over the years, Gail, her being paid homage to not only in articles, but I believe there is something that is happening tomorrow. Tell us a little bit more about how she's going to be remembered.
Right. So tomorrow, the Wits School of Creative Writing, under the leadership and auspices not of the institution but of the event, of Philippa de Villiers, who's a lecturer in creative writing and was one of Myesha's very, very good friends and another poet and phenomenal writer, is organizing a memorial. And it will be a reading. They'll be reading by Krista Kuljan, Makosazana Kaba, and Maren Bodenstein. Now, both Krista and Kosi Kaba were also very good friends of Myesha's. So these are women in the literary world who are gathering to recognize her work, and just women in literature in general, but specifically to recognize Myesha's 50th anniversary of her passing.
And I want to talk about, she was herself, considered a cultural architect. Her entry into the South African spoken word movement, what role would you say she played in building that foundation, particularly in its formative years?
Well, she was very, very active, and Myesha was very driven by the need to build community. She always spoke about that if you just had trophies and awards and money, but you had no community, then what is it worth? So she was never about self-aggrandizement or being a star. She was very much about becoming part of the poetry community, and then became a driving force in the poetry community. I think she gave a lot of support and succor and guidance to a lot of younger poets. I think she broke barriers so that younger and other poets could create space. So she played a very important role. And then, of course, she just had very deeply embedded friendships as well. So a lot of the poets that she was working with were women that were good friends of hers. So she was doing more than just building a poetry community. She was actually building a very real community and a family, because she had made South Africa her home. So she was a fun person to be around. She was much older than all of us, but she just had this girlish joy about her. So she really never, ever saw age. She would just go places that she would least expect her to be.
And when you speak about that, Gail, I remember the one time that I met her, it was at a lunch, it was an intimate lunch, and she was full of a lot of warmth, but I'm pretty sure I spotted her at several other events. I'm thinking of old Yeovil days where you and I actually have met several times at that scene, and she certainly was somebody with a great deal of energy, but purposeful energy.
Absolutely, and she was a diehard Yeovilite. I mean, she came to South Africa in 1993 and really did embed herself in Yeovil. And that's, in fact, where her and I met. We ended up being neighbors in a beautiful building, and the rest was history. But, yeah, I mean, she really made Yeovil her home. And in those early days when there was so much creativity and hope and passion and sex and drugs and kwaito. You know, she really, really made that her home, and she deeply embedded in the community. And you could go to Myesha's house on any day of the week, and you would find a plethora of artists visiting her, you know. You'd come from one day, it would be, you know, Zamnawana. The next day, it would be Kosi Kaba. The next day, it would be somebody else. You know, she just had quite an amazing array of people in her life. And so our home was really a mecca for a lot of us. It was a place that we just dropped in after work. Many of us, you know, you'd arrive after work at Myesha's house and there'd be somebody else interesting sitting around discussing poetry or just having a gossip. And she never let age stand in her way, you know. She used to go out to jazz clubs. She was a regular at all of the jazz clubs. She knew all of the musicians. She was friends with them. She worked with them. And she would tell the story about coming home very late one night and being pulled over by Metro cops. And they looked at her and they were shocked by this old lady being out at night. And they said, "How, Mama? Where are you going to this time of the night? What are you doing?" And she looked up, and in her southern drawl, she said, "I'm just living my life, officer. I'm just living my life," you know? So that was her. She was bold, she was courageous, and she really made Johannesburg her home.
And I'm glad you took her to jazz, because I was going to ask you about that next. Her life's work, her editing To Breathe Into Another Voice, that landmark anthology of jazz poetry. Just speak to me about how her work reflected the philosophy of poetry as a bridge between art forms, communities, and generations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think she was always a very big poet. She was doing a lot of writing, but she only really found her voice as a poet in South Africa. Before that, she had written poetry, and it was on the page. And I remember many a conversation with her at her home where I used to push her and say, "Myesha, poetry is not a written form. You know, the written is secondary to poetry. It's spoken. You have to get up and out and on the stage and be speaking your poetry." And eventually, of course, she found the courage and she went out and did it. But because she loved jazz so much and was so deeply embedded in the Johannesburg jazz community, she did start to collaborate with quite a few jazz musicians. And really, obviously, I mean, the connections between, you know, jazz and poetry are obvious. And so, yeah, she was very, very active in both of those communities. And when she passed away, both, you know, the poetry and the jazz community really, really came out to honor her. But she was a regular at most jazz clubs in South Africa, and she really, really did support jazz and the development of young jazz artists as well.
So again, one of the concerns raised in recent years is the loss of those spaces for open mics, the very spaces that Myesha helped champion. In your view, what has led to that? And what do you think her view would be of their absence today in today's poetry culture?
You know, I often wonder what she would make, and I speak to her every day, and then I imagine her answering me back in her accent, you know. I think she would be devastated by the loss of those spaces because she knows how hard they were to establish. Myesha worked very hard to have the spaces that she was working in, whether it was Feel a Sister or having a radio show on jazz or having regular Sunday jazz communities. She worked hard. I used to see her doing that work. So I think she would, excuse me, I think she would be devastated by the loss of those spaces and be very, very, very sad. But yeah, I mean, I think that we are all, you know, we're all at a loss for a lot of those spaces. But then other spaces have opened up. So I don't think it's all just, you know, downhill. But I do think that the spaces that she had established that are no longer there, it is very sad. I think there has been, as people have left Yeovil, I think a lot of those connections dissipated, and I think it is very sad. I mean, about the state of poetry today, I have no idea because I'm not even sure. I'm not sure who the young hot poets are at the moment. To my eternal shame, I have to admit that I've somewhat fallen out of it. I'm still in touch with the old guard. But I'm not a despairer, and Myesha was a very optimistic person who, because she came to South Africa she came when she was 40. So she had lived through the civil rights in the United States. She had seen a country turn a corner, and then came here and watched another country turn a corner. And she was always very philosophical about the cyclical nature of these things, civilizations rise and fall, And she was always very interested in engaging with young people. So I think that irrespective of what the status of poetry is today, she would probably have been as involved and as encouraging as she was back then.
So let's drill down to that nurturing spirit. What did she do in particular, especially for women and Black poets? Her mentoring approaches, if you could just share them with us, her values on ensuring that they're part of the current or even past slam-dominated environment.
Well, I think she was very concerned and irritated by it was very male-dominated. There was suddenly this, widespread groundswell of slam poetry, and poetry was really rocking in Joburg, and there were so many poetry events. But women were often not on the bill, or when they were given short shrift. It was a very, very boys' clubby thing. And Myesha had already, she also, I just must make it very clear that she wasn't just this overarching auntie who nurtured. She also learned a lot and acknowledged that she learned from people, and South Africa really shaped who she was. But I think that because she was immersed, in fact, the way Felicita came about was that her and Nsiki Mazwai and Napo Mashiane had been at a writer's workshop in Port Elizabeth. Then it was called Port Elizabeth, current Kabeja. They were there, and they were completely sidelined. They were not called on during discussions. They weren't included in the open mics. They weren't being heard in plenaries. So Myesha was having a cigarette with Nsiki, and they were furious, and then Napo joined them, and the three of them were furious about this. And then they decided, when we get back to Johannesburg, we're going to do something about it. So they got back to Joburg, and they put out a call to another 12 poets and writers that they knew personally, and said, hey, we're going to start this collective because we're tired of being squeezed out by the boys. Come and join us. And it was only Lebo Mashile who responded, and that's then how Felicita came about, with Myesha, Nsiki, Napo, and Lebo Mashile, and that's kind of how it came about. And she was just very, she was very nurturing, because South Africans are very respectful of older people. So everywhere she went, people would be calling her mama and according her respect. And I think Myesha took that respect with the grace that it was given. And she was certainly very helpful and encouraging of young poets who would reach out to her or ask her for help. She really, really was encouraging. And I watched a lot of people bloom and flourish around her because she made them feel that they could do it. And of course, South Africans are so enamored by an American accent. So, people would just, I love being her friend, because I swear, we got away with murder. Myesha would just speak, and the American accent and things would happen. So, yeah.
So I'd like to hear your views, Gail, as a writer and a feminist writer, that just your thoughts on the role of poetry today, and particularly in terms of published literature. Would you say there is a deliterarization of poetry? Are we seeing it more digitized? Is there less of the printed page in this culture that we live in?
Well, I don't know. I think that I fall between two stools. On the one hand, I think there's been such an amazing wave of South African publishing, especially young Black writers, in the last 20 years. You just look at it, the literary landscape has exploded. So I think there's a deep appreciation for the need for literature and the need for published literature. I do think that the digital environment does change things, and I certainly think that the advent of AI will no doubt change it, I think it will be a game changer, definitely. I don't think it's a bad thing that literature becomes a thing of the people as opposed to this high art. I think that, young people are taking it into digital spaces, but I also see lots of young people pushing the old traditions of just spoken word and poetry and slams, and I think that even if they are standing up and only doing it for TikTok or for Twitter or for any of the platforms, they're still writing it down somewhere. So it still exists as an artifact, as a written artifact.
And just finally, as her friend, as we approach that anniversary on the 5th of September, how would you say you carry forward her legacy and, the mentorship, as you've spoken about, the friendship? How are you putting it out in the world?
I've been thinking about it, and I don't know. I might just write a small something, because her legacy in my life, Myesha made the woman that I was. There was a 20-year age gap between us, and I kind of grew up with her. She taught me so much about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a black woman. She really helped me understand, to navigate whiteness and its recuperative powers. She just taught me the most basic things about life. She was genuinely like that older sister that we all needed and wanted, She had a great sense of humor. Again, the community thing. Through her, I've met and become friends with some amazing people. So, I would not be the person that I was had it not been for her. She was, after my mother and, my immediate family, she was a profound influence in my life, and exactly what I needed, because I think I was a very uptight young woman.
Okay.
And it was Myesha who
Gail,
told me to relax.
Gail, thank you so much for sharing that really enjoyable conversation, and hope to speak to you in due time when you do release that your contribution to her legacy. Gail Smith, a feminist writer, journalist and human rights activist, speaking to us about Myesha Jenkins and her legacy, how she showed us that poetry is not just an art, it's an act of living. She reminded us that words are seeds, and when planted in open hearts, they grow into change.